All right, week 2 of the money mini series. This is a hot topic. This is something people have been asking for a long time, and I'm going to give it to you finally. Today, I'm going to share you step by step what I do with my money date, how important it is. And what's cool, in a couple of weeks, Matt, my husband, and I are actually going to share with you how we do our joint family money date, because I think that's really important too. I couldn't bring anything to the table conversation-wise or goal-wise or money-wise if I didn't do this first. And this is something that I actually look forward to doing every month. It's something that feels really good. Even on the months where I don't hit my goals, I at least have a process. So I encourage you to give yourself a little grace, but a little bit of tough love, because the truth is, if you are not consistently auditing your financial situation, you are missing out on massive opportunity to have laser awareness of what is working and not working in your business. So let's dive in step by step. This is exactly how I set up my money date. I also want to add the asterisk. If you're listening to this and you're like, I preferred pen and paper, or I think I want to put on that platform, awesome. Do what works for you. But some of these core pieces are going to be really important to help you understand your financial situation in business. All right, let's jump on in. The first thing I do, this may blow your mind. This is earth shattering. This is so new and novel. Pick a day. I do it monthly. That cadence works best for me and where I'm at. And it gives me enough information to audit my business without overkill. I think if I did it more than that, it would be a lot. I block off a full day for it. So the first thing I do at the beginning of every year, now I have it into a rhythm, but literally pick a day of the month and then block it off. Like, actually, if you could pause this episode and go do that, that's how strongly I believe this is important. Here's the trick. Here's what this list doesn't do for you. You have to stick to it. And what I do is I actually have mine scheduled. It's the first of every month. And then what I do in January, I go through the whole year and I manually move that chunk of time. If the first falls on a weekend, I move it to the first Monday. If the first falls on a day where I already have an obligation, a speaking engagement, something like that, I move it to the next day. I make sure I safeguard that time because it is precious. It's important. And I really do benefit from spending one day working fully on my business and having that clarity of what's working, what's not working. So step 1, most important step, least interesting. Pick a day, stick to it. And even just that hack of moving it on the calendar, so helpful. Give it a cute name, color code it if that makes you feel better, whatever you need to do, pick a day and stick to it. And I really do feel like for most of us, it probably is a full day. The only person who it might not be, if this is like a super side hustle for you, maybe it's a half day. But everybody else, everyone who is here, if you're making consistent $100,000 a year, you're doing a day once a month. The second thing, get like mentally, emotionally, physically ready for this, because money can bring up some feelings. And I'm not going to spend too much time in the woo or the mindset of this stuff. All I know is this: awareness is power. If you were to try to go grocery shopping without a list, hard to know if you got everything, hard to know if you had a successful trip. If you were to play a sport without keeping score or having goalposts or the team's wearing different colors, hard to know if you win the game, right? So with money, I think what happens a lot, we don't have a clear process to know what is good or not good. And so we fill in the gaps when we look at these numbers, and it brings up emotions. And if we create a process that's coming from a place of clarity and peace and confidence, it makes it a lot easier to know, hey, I was short this month, but I was only $50 under my goal. Awesome. What can I do different next month? Okay. So get into the right mindset. For me, it's not sexy. I make a big cup of coffee. I pick a playlist. Shout out to my friend Becky. She made me a Mo Money playlist. So usually I play that. Sometimes it's just some instrumental music, whatever feels right for that day. I'm usually in my comfies, and that's literally how I start my money day. Then for me, I'll walk you through literally what I do, and then you can take and apply what makes sense. So I actually print off all of my bank statements. And this was inspired by my loathing of tax season. My goal each year as a business owner is to make that process easier and easier. We're getting there, but one thing I learned from last year, if I just print off my bank statements each month and also reconcile my QuickBooks each month, because I do my own QuickBooks, then it makes it a lot easier at the end of the year, because it's just double checking my work versus starting from ground zero. So I print off my bank statements. I mentioned in last week's episode, if you listen to that, I use my bank statements to understand the cash in and cash out. And when it comes to a money date, that is the numbers I'm looking at. I'm not looking at by the penny, what is QuickBooks telling me? Me, Kelsey, to have a quick understanding of my financial situation, I want to know cash in, cash out, and that is what the bank is telling me. I'm not going to proclaim to be an accounting expert or a financial advisor, so if you're an accountant and you're sweating hearing that, then please reach out to your clients and correct them, or correct me, I guess, but all that to say, this whole exercise really is just awareness for me as a business owner. After I print out all of my bank statements, I literally manually add things up. There's something about it. I prefer it. I'm at the stage of business where I like to have that awareness of where every penny goes. I'm also looking for discrepancies like, hey, I got double charged for that. Or, oh, I thought I have the receipt here. It wasn't for that amount. It's a lot easier to do that stuff month by month than at the end of every year. So I go through my bank statements. I add up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 6 different things I add up. I'll explain how I add them. Then I'll explain a couple of hacks I have for keeping track of this that I find to be pretty helpful. And then we'll keep going. So I add up my revenue. How much money did Kelsey Marie Coaching make? And if I'm paid in a couple different platforms, for me, that's Stripe, Honeybook, very occasionally on PayPal. I have an affiliate link that still is rocking and rolling. Shout out Virtue. If you ever need shampoo, I still have my link live because back from my hair days, I want my clients to be able to get the products they need. I never talk about it, but all that to say, I go to all these places and I make sure I have the accurate revenue amount. The second bucket I add up is costs, and costs in Kelsey land is this. It's everything besides people and taxes. So I just lump all my costs together. And like I said, I manually write it out. The business I have today, I can do that. If I were to still have a hair salon, that would be hard to calculate. And again, I'll share a couple hacks on this. Then the next bucket I have is owner pay. How much did I pay myself? And the next bucket from there, what was my team pay? That could be contractors, that could be W-2s, whatever that is and whatever applies for your business size. The last bucket is taxes. And for me, again, Kelsey version, how I do it, I take all of my revenue, I subtract all of those costs, the overall costs, how much I paid myself, how much I paid my team, and then I multiply what's left over by a percentage, and that's about how much I set aside each month for taxes. It's not perfect math, but it's enough to cover my needs, and typically for me, doing it that way, I have a little extra and I can use that to pay my accountant his fees. Thank you, Chad. I can use that to buy a camera or a new phone or things like that in my business. So for me, that's the rough napkin math I use to set aside for taxes. And then what's left over for me is profit. So those are the numbers I add up every month. I have dollar amounts for all of them. I also have percentages for all of them. And if you're going to remember, last week we talked about having clear personal financial goals and clear business financial goals. This is that document in real life. So if you did your homework from last week, you probably already have this built out. It's just massaging it a little bit to be more of an interactive tool than just a list of goals that we're aiming for. The percentage thing I find really helpful because I want to know the patterns within my business. It's less about per month. Occasionally it is that, but I want to know the patterns. I want to know consistently about what are my costs per month. I want to know consistently how much I'm paying my team. There's been months in the history of my business where I was paying my team members more than me, and I would not face this. So this episode exists kind of for an old version of me that would not face the realities. You can't make changes if you don't know the reality. And I learned that the hard way. So I operate very differently. The more I've been transparent and honest with the financial situation, I don't know if it's that or being more confident in my processes or whatever. All I know is my business is making more than it ever has, even when I had my other salon business. And it also allows me to have really clear, powerful conversations with my husband. And we were able to hit a really substantial financial goal recently. And I really believe it's because of these goals and then keeping track of it consistently that contributed. So I mentioned earlier I was going to share some hacks with you. You're probably listening and you're like, revenue, costs, owner pay, payroll/team, taxes, profit. That's a lot of different buckets to keep track of. It is. So I found this is what works best for me. This may not make sense in the reality that you are in, but if you're 6 figures and above, I would argue you most likely could do a version of this that works for you. So revenue is my business checking account. I make sure anything that pays me goes directly into that account. Costs, I put everything on a business credit card. So that way I can just look to my business credit card to add up that number. Owner pay, I just this year put myself on payroll. Before that, I was doing an owner's draw. I would talk to your accounting professional to make sure what you're doing makes sense for the chapter of business that you're in. For me, putting myself on payroll on a system literally just makes my life and my accountant's life easier. And that's pretty much what motivated that decision for now. I'm also in a consistent revenue position where I can afford that and feel confident in that. And that's not going to be a pain point or stressor. But then what happens is every month I do this monthly money date with myself. In the months where I make extra, I'm able to actually pay myself a little bit of a bonus those months or save for a retreat or whatever I'm saving for next in my business. But the owner pay side, literally not a financial provider professional, but I just move that money prior to being on payroll. I would just move that money once a month from my business account to my personal account. And I would always label it just to give myself the mental note, to give QuickBooks the mental note, Kelsey, or I would just say like January salary. And that helped me and made it pretty easy to keep track of. And then taxes, my business savings account that most of us just get with our businesses, I just named it to taxes. I put a percentage in there of how much percent of profit I want to put in every month, but then that just makes it easier. And then the last one, profit, I just opened a second business savings account. So those are my hacks, just using your accounts in front of you to be more defined buckets for each of these things. So that way, when you go to add up the totals, some of the math is already done for you. It's just a matter of making sure it's accurate. Then once I add up those totals, and for me, I write it down and then I plug it into my Airtable, I then calculate my percentages. And again, I think that's so important because I'm looking for patterns. If I'm consistently, say I have a really good month and my percentage, everything's going to look awesome in that scenario, right? But if I have a couple months that are consistently like 10K, if my team pay is eating up 30%, I either need to consider letting somebody go or I really need to light a fire under my tush and do more sales. It gives me laser clarity to know what to solve in my business, especially if I'm in a situation where my costs are as low as they possibly can, which I encourage everyone listening to this, try your best within reason, right? But try to be really efficient with that cost percentage because we don't want you overspending because we cannot guarantee the ROI in growing your business. And that's a culprit I see a lot. People don't calculate their costs. They just operate off of how it feels and they don't realize how much they're spending in their business. So after I calculate the totals, plug it in, I calculate percentages, I plug that in, I compare my goals to reality. So if you're doing this money date thing for the very first time ever, hi, welcome to the club and thank you for being here. And I'm proud of you for doing this for yourself. But maybe the very first time you do it, you use the reality of that month to set your goal percentages. And I highly recommend that because that is the truth. That is where we're at. And then from there, we're like, okay, my costs are consistently 50% of my business. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know what business you're in, but that would be pretty high. If you have all these different buckets I listed out, that would be pretty high. So if my costs are 50% of my business, what if I make my goal to get it down to 45% next month? And then I can slowly start to adjust my goal. But having those percentages and the goals established, it allows me to see where those gaps are. And then I can get really clear on what to do from there. The other piece I mentioned in the last episode, that personal goal, that business goal, that's where this factors in. So just making sure you have a place visually. I just put on the left side, when I have revenue in parentheses, I literally just have the goal percentage. Obviously it's 100%. And then for costs, I have the goal percentage and so on and so forth. And that is where I'm able to check, okay, for the month of March, here's what my actual percentages are. Here's how they line up with that goal. And then from there, I can leave myself some notes or make some changes moving forward. Then after I add up all those totals, I do the percentages, I move the money around because I have found it's a lot easier to separate those things out and have those buckets than just to have a bunch of cash in the bank account. Otherwise, I may spend it. And the other thing that has been helpful, and this is something I've recently done, I had to establish a business checking account minimum because month after month, I was getting to a place where I was profitable, which is awesome. It means I'm making more than I'm spending. That's the goal, right? But I'm profitable and I didn't establish a rule for myself. So every month I would go through this exercise, do those percentages, and I would kind of be like, how much should I leave in there? Should I leave $2,000 or $10,000? Should I leave 5 or 7? And I was just mentally doing all this guessing work. So I finally just established what my minimum is that covers my needs, that I feel comfortable in. And therefore I'm able to invest that other money for personal reasons. It's still accessible if I need it. But I think having those parameters built into this monthly money date is just going to make it so much easier to stick to your financial goals. So move the money around based off those rules. And then that profit account, I think, is awesome for things like paying off debt. If you are listening to this and you have business debt, in my Kelsey opinion, again, not a financial person, but in my Kelsey opinion, any extra penny I'm making is going to paying that off as much as possible. I am paying that off. That is going to be more important than doing some growth oriented things, at least that point of business for the most part. There may be some situations where that's not the case, but in general, I would recommend that. Once I'm able to pay off my business debt, maybe I use that profit account, and that's hiring. That's how I'm able to hire people like me. Maybe you're thinking about hiring a business coach, or you're thinking about joining a mastermind, which I may or may not be having in the coming months. You're thinking of some kind of continuing ed. Maybe that's what that profit account is more. How do I invest back into my business? So you can see by having these different buckets, it just gives you the clarity to know when you can purchase stuff and when you can't. Then after that, this is so important. You got to share these numbers with somebody. And this is something I didn't do for a long time. I actually did not share all these numbers with Matt. And I mean, granted, he didn't really share his numbers with me. It was hard for us to work towards a goal without that awareness. And now we share everything. So I actually, at the end of my personal money day, typically we have our couple money day that same day at the end of the day at night, glass of wine or beer or whatever. And I'm like excited, even on the months where it's not as financially successful as I had hoped, I'm still excited to share it because I have the clarity, I have the process. Hey, I did really well. I broke even this month, but here's what I'm going to do moving forward. Here's the people, the conversations I'm having. Here's the number of calls that I booked this month, but I'm going to up that for next month. And I think that's so, so important. And that comes from the personal awareness. It's hard to be moving in the same direction without that clarity and defined goal. And it starts with you building it for yourself. Even if you're in a dynamic where potentially your partner makes more money than you, or your partner is the one really handling the personal financial stuff, I want to challenge you, and you're listening to this episode, so obviously you have some level of interest. I'm going to challenge you to be the CFO of this business that you have, because odds are you don't have one hired out and you need to be the one doing that for yourself. So that point was all about sharing those numbers with your partner. And then after that, a little celebration sesh, whether that's a glass of wine, whether that is going out to dinner, making a dinner, taking a selfie, high-fiving, whatever that looks like for you. I think it's important to celebrate that you did this. And then the last thing, here's the other things I do. When I have my monthly money date, I block off the day, but I'm not just doing the money stuff. I also am, for me, in this current season, because I want taxes to be easier and just less stressful, less unknown for me, I'm reconciling my QuickBooks. I'm going to give some context here. I have a degree in entrepreneurship. I studied business prior to what I'm doing now. In a weird way, I actually like my QuickBooks now that I understand how it needs to be set up and how to do things. I also, as a business coach, don't have a ton of expenses. Most of my expenses are my team members and then the occasional coffee or lunch. Like that occasionally I have like Google Suite or Buzzsprout where I host my podcast, like things like that. But in general, I don't have a ton of complicated expenses. If I did, I would consider hiring a bookkeeper to reconcile all of that. But for now, I do it myself. I like that awareness. It's not a pain point for me, especially now that I'm doing it every month. And it helps me really understand what's going on with my money. And something I'm doing this year especially is I'm comparing what numbers I'm coming up with based off of my bank statements, what numbers are happening inside of QuickBooks, and seeing where there's potentially misalignment or ensuring that the math is mathing, if that makes sense. The other thing I do during my monthly money date is I do all my KPIs. I think I've shared a couple podcasts, but I'm really paying attention to how the podcast is performing. I actually have a whole stats meeting I do every month with my podcast editor. Shout out Nicole as you edit this. That's been really helpful. So when I'm looking at KPIs from a podcast and social media perspective, she actually provides a lot of those and we talk through them together strategically, but I do them personally for my business. Every month, I'm looking at things like how many discovery calls did I book? How many clients did I sign? I'm looking at, did I go on a mastermind? And then maybe reflecting on, was that helpful? What changes did I make? How did that impact my business? So I'm really digging into the quantifiable and qualifiable data points in my business every single month. The last thing I do is my mileage IQ. I just have that because I do drive a decent amount for my business. So I go through the calendar and then my app, I'm able to do personal business. And that is my money date. It sounds like a lot because it is, but it's all really helpful information. And the more that you do it and the more it becomes a habit, the easier it becomes. And here's what's cool. I'm a big proponent of community. I would love, if you're listening to this episode, for you to go do this and then tell me how it went. I think the best place to do that is actually leave a comment on this podcast episode, either of your game plan to go have a money date with yourself, anything you learned in doing a money date with yourself, or if you're willing to share some of the numbers you came up with or things you learned in that process. I'd love to hear it. But at the end of the day, the most important piece with a money date is doing it. It's the consistency. I have learned so much about my own business by paying attention to those patterns. And this is something I have all of my clients do. And it's been very eye-opening, even for the ones who feel like they have it all figured out. It's been so helpful to make sure we're all moving forward towards our goals, making adjustments when needed, and just having an awareness and an empowered mindset when it comes to our financial situation. And the last thing I want to say is if you're working with a professional, whether it's a financial advisor, an accountant, an EA, a bookkeeper, someone credentialed who's managing finances in your business, and you feel like you're not able to get the answers and resources you need, I encourage you to take control of that conversation. That means asking the questions you want to ask. If you're listening to this and you are a financial advisor, EA, CPA, what I just mentioned, some of your clients are afraid to talk to you and they don't understand what's going on with their finances and they're ashamed to say that out loud. And I say that because this is just an ongoing conversation I'm having with a lot of people right now, and there's a reason for it. So if you fall in that camp, I encourage you to ask for what you need. There's no shame in clarification. They work for you. And if you're a service provider, how can you potentially add in some more check-ins, accountability, support for your people to make sure they really understand what is going on with their finances? Here's the deal. Without a money date, money is coming in and out. Like, it's happening. Having the money date gives you the awareness, and having an awareness gives you strategy, because then you can know what steps to take. As I mentioned earlier, Matt and I do a monthly money date now, which is kind of a recent thing. We started leading up for the wedding as we were saving for that. We were really convinced we did not want to go into any debt for it, and we didn't. We paid cash for everything. We did get some support from family members, which was huge, but at the end of the day, we had an amazing 257-person wedding without going into debt, and I think a lot of that came from having these consistent check-ins, having a game plan, constantly talking about it, problem solving as it came up, and we've just kept that momentum going, and that is what helped us get to our financial goal a couple weeks ago. So that's what I have for you. Here's your homework. I want you to go pick that time on the calendar. And this, as you're listening, is April. I would love for you to carve out some time and do January's monthly money date. I would do February and March. You may want to break it up into 3 days, but I would do it. I think it would be so helpful for you at this chapter to really see what's going on and understand the different percentages, what's working, what's not working. It's going to give you so much clarity and confidence moving forward. And then please comment if you found this episode helpful. I am really passionate about this money stuff because it's a huge piece of what I do. It's not the only piece, but it is a big one. And I would love to hear from you if you found this episode valuable. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Join us next week. My friend Frankie is coming back. If you're an OG When I Grow Up podcast listener, he actually was on the podcast way back when. We have a really interesting conversation about passive income. He did a challenge where he tried different passive income streams for an entire year. He's also on track or aiming to retire early at 45, and he shares a lot of his lessons learned. So I encourage you to go get aware and get really intimately familiar with what's going on with your money. I think that starts with the money date, and I believe you now have the tools to go do that. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next week.